A nation in the center of the Middle East is collapsing right before our eyes. You just have to have some foresight to see it. This is Baghdad, May 2022. The city is engulfed by a sandstorm, creating thick clouds of blinding and suffocating orange dust. Thousands of people were hospitalized at the time with respiratory problems. Sandstorms are common in this part of the world, but they've been happening more frequently and more severely. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, Iraq ranks among the 5 countries in the world most vulnerable to climate change. It is also one of the worst prepared. Its water stress level currently stands at 3.7 points out of 5, with 5 being the highest level of scarcity. This indicates a condition where there is not enough available fresh water to meet the demand of a population. It affects nearly every fabric of society. Think of strict water quotas per household, fluctuating food and energy prices, and so on. By 2040, Iraq's water stress level is expected to reach 4.6. That is a terrifying number. It's as close to death as a country can get. Decades of armed conflicts, extreme population growth, and poor infrastructure have pushed Iraq to the brink. Such an existential crisis would be troubling anywhere. But in Iraq, domestic instability would feed into the wider region, triggering a domino effect of radicalization and extremism that could drag much of the world down with it. The government says it has a plan, but it's a no-win situation. Like when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Today's sponsor is Odoo. It's the go-to all-in-one management software that helps you spend less time doing tedious administrative work and more time doing what's really important. It has a ton of apps. You can easily streamline all your invoicing, accounting, sales, emails, and many more. Normally, you would be using a dozen other platforms to do the same thing that Odoo does single-handedly. That is pretty neat. The best thing about Odoo is that the first application is free for life, with unlimited hosting and support. Let's use this opportunity to make a website of our own. No banking details are needed to sign up, so you know this is the real deal. Okay, here we go. I want a blog. Let's just go with news with this one. Select color. I'm going with this one. Now, the pages and features, I'm just going to use news. That's good enough. This layout looks pretty good. Select that. And there it is. You can customize it precisely like you want using the block system. Let's make a blog about Iraq. I'm going to make a new page really quickly. Post a cover here. Upload a photo. Change the title. Easy peasy. If you're short of inspiration, the website builder app has the tools to help you out. Check out Odoo today by hitting the link in the description and supporting me by supporting Odoo. Water is an instrumental part of Iraq's story. Known as the Land of Two Rivers, the Euphrates and Tigris provided the land with a steady, predictable flow of water. They chart a course from Turkey, Syria, and Iraq before emptying into the Gulf. During antiquity, Iraq emerged as a breadbasket. Its rivers made large-scale agriculture possible, allowing for large numbers of people to settle, harness its resources, and engage in trade and commerce. The Euphrates and Tigris were thus essential in the development of early civilization. However, these rivers were not without tribulations. Since no dams or reservoirs were controlling the water flow, seasonal flooding was a regular occurrence, damaging properties and crops on the riverbanks. Starting in the 1970s, however, the situation reversed. Instead of floods, a scarcity developed. Less and less water flowed into Iraq. Today, the water crisis spans the length of the country. In 2023, the Mosul Dam, which is the largest dam in Iraq with a total storage capacity of 11 billion cubic meters, reached its lowest level since its commission in 1986. If water levels keep declining, the adjacent Mosul Lake will dry up within a few years. Some 1.7 million residents nearby will be left without power and water for crop irrigation. Meanwhile, the Dukan Dam has seen its capacity drop from 7 billion to just 2 billion cubic meters of water. More than 3 million people in the vicinity rely on this dam for their daily freshwater needs. The nearby Darbandikan Dam isn't doing much better. Its water level has dropped by 7 meters, and the dam only operates at a third of its capacity. The decline in water resources has affected all avenues of society. Fishing, agriculture, and industrial output are down, but the situation is even worse in Iraq's south. As the water flows downward, much of its quantity and quality is lost. Iraqi cities and towns in the center depend heavily on the Tigris and Euphrates for water, all the more so in recent years with precipitation levels 40% below average. What's more, by the time the water flow reaches the southern parts of Iraq, waste from outdated industrial and agricultural infrastructure ends up in the riverbeds themselves, causing massive health risks. In 2018, for instance, some 118,000 people were hospitalized in Basra due to symptoms related to water pollution. Years later, in 2023, the UN Development Programme found that the salinity levels at the confluence of the Euphrates and Tigris near Basra measured at 10 times higher than acceptable World Health Organization standards. Meanwhile, still in the south, as water levels have declined, seawater from the Gulf has taken its place, intruding nearly 190 kilometers northward. This environmental degradation is destroying the Mesopotamian marshes, a wetland area located on the floodplains of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. The region is home to a vast biodiversity of endangered species, not to mention a distinct local culture that is one of a kind. But this entire ecosystem is now at risk of extinction. Frankly, the outcome of all these factors is that Iraq's twin rivers are dying. It could happen as early as 2040, according to the Ministry of Water Resources. If these rivers die, Iraq is likely to die with them. Baghdad's misfortune is that it sits at the bottom of the river basin. About 90% of the water that flows through the Euphrates River originates from the mountains in Anatolia, Turkey. For the Tigris, Turkey's share sits at 45%. Syria, Iran, and Iraq make up the rest of the Tigris River's water flow, but Turkey retains the biggest share. Starting in the 1970s, however, upstream Turkey began constructing dams and reservoirs along its rivers. Turkish officials sought to boost economic activity in the Anatolia region by harnessing hydropower. In the decades following, Turkey built more than 600 dams and reservoirs on both rivers, with another 600 slated for construction in the next decades. The more dams Turkey built, the less water flowed into Iraq. One recent example is the Ilisu Mega Project, which consists of 22 dams and 19 hydroelectric power plants along the Tigris and Euphrates near Turkey's borders with Syria and Iraq. Thanks to this mega project, Turkey was able to terraform its landscape, creating new lakes and croplands. However, while the Ilisu project is suitable for Turkey, it is a disaster for Iraq. In the coming years, the water flow of the Tigris River in Iraq is expected to decline by an additional 56%. There are no formal agreements between Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Turkey concerning the management of water. So by law, the Turks are well within their rights to construct whatever they like on their side of the border. However, seen from a wider angle, this means that the Tigris-Euphrates basin, home to tens of millions, is subject to Turkish terms in all but name. This isn't some malicious scheme though. Turkey has regularly turned the tap to release more water inflow into Iraq, but the Turkish policy is constrained by climate. Precipitation is at its lowest level in 62 years. So much so that in 2021, low rainfall, drought, and heat triggered massive wildfires that spread across the country. So Turkey's need for water resources bodes ill for downstream Iraq. The results speak for themselves. Since 1970, the annual flow to the Euphrates and Tigris rivers has dropped from 40 and 45 billion cubic meters each to a mere 15 billion and 20 billion respectively. Iraq needs about 77 billion cubic meters to meet its industrial, agricultural, and civilian needs, but the amount of available water is only 35 billion cubic meters. This deficit is a death sentence in slow motion. Still worse, Iraq's own Kurdish autonomous state is contemplating constructing dams on all its tributary rivers, reducing the downstream flow even more. So far, 14 dams have been completed, 17 are under construction, and another 40 are in the planning phase. By the end of the project, Iraqi Kurdistan could have up to 245 dams and reservoirs. Impressive, but that would also leave even less water for downstream Baghdad. Even so, the federal government has failed to resolve its nationwide water deficit. After decades of arbitrary supervision, no real progress has been made in terms of water management in agricultural and industrial practices. Much of the country's irrigation is done by traditional means. As a result, billions of cubic meters of water are lost in evaporation and other wasteful practices. Agriculture consumes about 63% of Iraq's total water capacity, but because of inefficient and poor management, much of the country is left at the mercy of the desert. Today, over 90% of Iraq is affected by drought. The desert is crawling closer on all fronts, particularly in the south, where seawater is simultaneously creeping inland. Since 1970, Iraq has lost more than half its arable land, and an additional 100 square kilometers of arable land is lost every year. Sandstorms, as seen in Baghdad in 2022, used to occur twice a year. Now, it's happening 20 times a year. Iraqi academics say that in the coming 2 decades, the country could be facing 272 dust days each year. Some 7 million civilians are now affected by the water deficit and its secondary effects. This will have far-reaching consequences since between 20 and 30% of Iraq's workforce is employed in agriculture. Less arable land threatens food security and increases food prices. Job opportunities are affected as well, since shrinking arable land leads to fewer workers required in the agricultural sector. Thus, as the land dries up and livelihoods are lost, people pack up their belongings and migrate elsewhere. This is a multi-layered crisis because the federal government had in fact planned to invest in agriculture to diversify its economy away from hydrocarbons. So agriculture was meant to be Iraq's ticket to economic reform. But with water resources in decline, that plan looks unlikely. Iraq's existential crisis is not exclusively confined to its boundaries. Sitting in the center of the Middle East, instability in Iraq would seep into the periphery and trigger a wave of radicalization and extremism. There are too few democratic and institutional avenues available to address the complications ahead. Iraq's crisis, therefore, is the world's problem. As drought hits the land and civilians feel marginalized, militancy is bound to surge. The last time Iraqis felt this way, jihadist forces established ISIS, which then took over parts of Iraq, Syria, and beyond. The group committed numerous atrocities, including mass executions, bombings, and enslavement, and sought to spread extremism worldwide through its propaganda and violent acts. ISIS was horrible, but its next iteration would be worse because the circumstances would be more desperate. As the water, food, and energy crisis turns Iraq into a hotbed of instability, armed and desperate people with nothing to lose would join the ranks of ISIS 2.0, who would then tunnel into the wider region with a vengeance. What makes the crisis even more urgent is its timing. Iraq's population is currently growing unsustainably. It is estimated to eclipse 63 million by 2040, up from the current 46 million. By 2071, the Iraqi population will reach 94 million, surpassing even that of Iran and Turkey. But that's not the end of it. The population will keep growing uninterrupted, reaching 111 million before the end of the century. Demographic studies are difficult to predict, but if Iraq stays on course, demand for water will increase while supply will decrease. With less water to go around, public services will steadily decline, food security will face collapse, healthcare will drop, and so on. By 2040, Iraq will become a land without rivers. The mighty Tigris and Euphrates will die slowly. Water will still flow marginally, but it will not reach its final outlet in the Gulf. Every fiber of Iraqi society will be affected until the country becomes an inhospitable place to live. That is a drastic fall from grace, considering that Iraq was once known as the Fertile Crescent. But stranger things have happened. Countless historic cities, nations, and cultures have faded into obscurity. Even within Iraq itself, there are ancient scriptures that no one reads, languages no one speaks, and ruins that were once the capitals of powerful empires. However, while Iraq's water crisis seems overwhelming, it is not impossible. Some small steps have been taken in the right direction. In 2023, for instance, near Basra, a new $200 million water desalination plant was commissioned with technical support and funding from Japan. This facility covers the needs of about 400,000 people. In the same vicinity, an American-based project is underway that will modernize water infrastructure for up to 650,000 people. Meanwhile, China is negotiating the construction of additional desalination plants to meet the needs of millions more. For Iraq, this is the way forward. But the federal government needs to do more, much more. It needs to modernize its infrastructure and build recycling processes and pollution treatment units. It needs to treat wastewater and construct the necessary facilities for it. As a temporary measure, Iraq can tap into its groundwater, but more importantly, it needs to support farmers in using modern irrigation methods to reduce water loss. Baghdad also needs to find a way to pause and reassess the dam projects in Iraqi Kurdistan. A country fighting itself has no chance at redemption. Additionally, some sort of arrangement is necessary with upstream Turkey. Call it climate diplomacy. Iraq's collapse is not in Turkey's best interest. Instability breeds instability, and Turkish officials understand that. Though lacking a legal framework, in 2021 a memorandum of understanding was reached with Turkey calling for fair water flow into downstream Iraq. The terms have yet to be fleshed out and are subject to further negotiations, but it's a step in the right direction. In all, by use of new infrastructure, modernization, and multilateral arrangements, Iraq can still plan its comeback. However, it needs to be done urgently before the situation becomes irreversible, and Iraq's problem becomes everyone's problem. In the ledger of life, time is the only non-renewable asset. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. If you approve of what we do, please leave a comment, hit the like button, and mayhaps share the video. In any case, thank you for your time, and so on.